Welcome, everyone, to Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We're your hosts and co-founders of FantasyForesight.com, coming to you from the Rambo Fixture Company studios. I'm Ben.
And I'm Jay.
You ready to get rolling, Jay?
You know it. Let's do this.
All right, let's go. Welcome in, everyone. It is a beautiful fall-like football Saturday morning. It is September 5th. We've got our guy Steve at FF_encyclopedia back with us. This is the very last episode of our preview pod series, and we saved the best for last for you. So we've got the preview of the wide receivers and the tight ends of the electrifying NFC South. We have got almost all top 15 type top receivers, 3 tight end ones, and then a couple of very relevant wide receivers to round out the episode. And once again, Fantasy Foresight, the podcast, is live. How you doing this morning, Jay?
Ben, you know what? We are coming off maybe one of our most fun episodes in our history so far, with well over 100 episodes. And I'm jazzed, man. I'm juiced up. Let's go. It's our final preview podcast episode. We've got a heck of a list of players to dive into this morning. It's really the final weekend of fantasy drafts, because after this, we have real football this week, guys. Knock on some wood. Everything's looking, it's almost too good to be true. I'm speechless. I can't imagine. And maybe even more than that, I just can't wait to see how I'm going to be proven right yet again this week. So, Steve, how are you doing this morning, my friend?
Well, Jay, you just gave me a good laugh. But, no, pretty good. You know, hey, Basement Steve, living that basement life at 8 after 8 a.m. here in Lakewood, Ohio. So,
nice.
Yeah, happy to be on, guys. And this should be a really good one. Absolutely. A lot of really, really fancy relevant players like you guys alluded to.
Yes, sir. All right.
Ben. Yeah.
Before we dive in, if this is your first time listening, just know that we are speaking in terms of single QB full PPR redraft format by default. All of our ADP data comes from fantasyfootballcalculator.com according to 12-team full PPR settings. And all of our fantasy finishes, as well as fantasy points per game calculations, are all based on full PPR, limited to weeks 1 through 16, according to fantasypros.com. And with that out of the way, let's dive right in. We are going to go in order of their ADP. We're going to start off with the tight ends and end up with the wide receivers. And to kick this episode off, I am thrilled to welcome back to the NFL Tampa Bay Buccaneers tight end Rob Gronkowski. Gronk is back, baby, and he is going as the tight end 6 at the 6'11", behind Zach Ertz, behind Darren Waller, in front of Evan Ingram and Hayden Hurst. The Bucs tight ends have the 4th worst tight end strength of schedule and the 13th ranked offensive line. The aggregate projection for Gronk is tight end 9, and Total Foresight likes him as tight end 4. Obviously did not play last season, but you know, in 2018, he was still tight end 7 in fantasy points per game. And in 2017, he was tight end 1 in fantasy points per game. At playerprofiler.com, here's the big but when it comes to Gronk. He was number 2 in injury probability and fragility rating. He dealt with a ton of injuries over his career. And listen, I've heard a lot of people saying it's been a long time since, quote, Gronk has been Gronk. But the last time he played in just 12 games, battling through injuries, he was still tight end 10 overall, tight end 7 in fantasy points per game, and only supported by just 3 touchdowns. He still had 45 catches on 70 targets for 658 yards on top of those 3 touchdowns. Again, while battling through those injuries in just 12 games. But now Gronk said he feels better than ever because of that year off. And I don't think I've heard anyone talk about what I'm about to talk about. You have to go all the way back to 2010 to find the last time that Gronk had an absolute beast of a wide receiver and Hall of Fame legend Randy Moss on the outside to distract defenses. Well, now Gronk has Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, so he's going to face the lightest coverage of his entire career, and that's just a pure fact. You cannot argue that. And by the way, in that one full year with Randy Moss as a rookie, Gronk still had 10 touchdowns. If he stays healthy all year in 2020, I honestly believe that 10 touchdowns is Gronk's floor. And remember, just 3 years ago, He's better than a lot of still relevant fantasy tight ends today. 3 years ago, he was better than Travis Kelce, better than Zach Ertz, better than Evan Ingram, better than Hunter Henry, better than Jared Cook. Gronk is less than 5 months older than Travis Kelce. Think about that. A healthy Gronk who's probably actually still got it, running with those monster wide receivers, and he has all that chemistry with Brady. I think it's going to be a nice year for Gronk.
Oh, man. You do make a lot of good points, Ben. I will say this. There is still O.J. Howard and Cameron Brate there. Mm-hmm. So, I would probably temper expectations a little bit as far as the red zone touchdowns. But like we talked about when we were talking about the Brady's red zone attempts this past Wednesday, Brady will probably likely be right up there as a league leader when it comes to his, red zone passing attempts. And that certainly bodes well for Gronk. So, yeah, man, it's for me anyways, I still like a lot of the guys going around Gronk just because I do think he's probably going to be pretty touchdown dependent. But you're right. I haven't heard a lot of people talk about all the attention that the other pass catchers in this offense are going to be attracting. And I've thought of Gronk as more of that like touchdown dependent tight end, but maybe he'll get more touchdowns.
You're right.
Yeah, but maybe he'll get more touchdowns than I thought was possible.
So let me get this straight. We love Gronk, who's 31, had a tight end one season in 2017, missed an entire year, and then battled through a season with injury. But we hate David Johnson, who's 3 years younger, finished as RB1 in 2016, missed a season, and then battled through another with injury. Am I clear on that?
Like, hoping for an apples to apples comparison with you is so far beyond the realm of reasonable expectation. You can't even do like fruit to vegetables. Like, you're so far off in your comparisons. Two different positions entirely. And okay.
Similar fantasy finishes. One guy's 3 years younger.
Well, here's the thing. Steve's absolutely right that Gronk is very touchdown dependent. I don't think he's going to have more than like 600, 700 receiving yards. However, I see the path for him to have a very Eric Ebron a la a couple seasons ago like season where he just had a ridiculous amount of red zone touchdowns. So, that's what I see for Gronk. Now, Hayden Hurst, we're going to talk about him in just a minute. I'm not saying that I like Gronk better than everybody on this group. Obviously, you've got to reach quite a few rounds earlier to get Zach Ertz and Darren Waller. Of course, I like both of those guys better than him. Evan Ingram, he can't stay on the field. And, Hayden Hurst is a question mark. So all I'm saying is that, I am more speaking to the fact that I feel like people have just totally written Gronk off. And I just think like, no, I know there's other tight ends there, but I just think that, what if Gronk is still every bit as athletic as he's ever been, just like his counterpart, Travis Kelce? What if that is the case? And if that is the case, look out. We could be seeing some big-time Gronk this year.
Ben, in all honesty, and Steve, this season, Gronk, in my eyes, is more like Jordan Reed of a couple years ago, where when he's on the field, he could be the best tight end in football, or at least near the top, but there's just so much risk and uncertainty around it that, I don't know how long he's going to last. And to Steve's point, they do have two other very good tight ends on that team, so opportunity may be limited. To both of your points, that touchdown dependency could be there, but they do have a lot of other options in the red zone. I don't know if they're better than Gronk necessarily, but if you're looking for some, high risk, high reward in your tight end position, you want to go.
I can already see your face breaking. You're not funny.
What?
Yeah, I feel like you're like a David Johnson references coming.
No. If that's your preference and you have an apt backup plan for if he does pick up some kind of injury, then great, roll with it because, even when Jordan Reed was kind of hitting, the downhill of his career, when he was on the field, he was dynamic and effective and could win you fantasy matchups in a given week. But with Gronk, I feel like you need to have some kind of backup plan. You need to have some kind of target available to you on the waiver wire or maybe somebody stashed on your bench. his risk and uncertainty for me is just too great for me to roll. I'd rather have somebody I know I can trust week to week.
Do think about this though, guys. Seriously, over the last 5 years, when Gronk was playing, I mean, he was like the offensive weapon on that team. Defenses are keying to stop him.
I'm with you, man. I see
defenses are going to look at him as just a guy for the first time in his career. And that's what really struck me as I dove into the research for this episode, is that, like, man, I can't think of the last time Gronk had a legit big dog on the outside, and I went back and looked, and it's Randy Moss, man.
I can just see him having like 3 catches on 5 targets for like 60 yards a game. He'll break off some of those big passes because, like you said, he's going to have room to operate. I just don't know if there's going to be a lot of volume there. And, in weeks where he doesn't get that touchdown, I mean, it'll still be nice. You'll still get 6 to 8 points out of him from the tight end position, which is a fine floor, I suppose, in the tight end spot. In weeks where he scores, you get 14 points. And I just don't know if you're going to get any of those old monster weeks out of Gronk.
Well, I think that's pretty much baked into his price tag, too, when you think about it. Because at the end of the day, like, back in prime Gronk days, he was a guy that was going at the end of first rounds, top of the second round. So, I mean, if you can get him in the middle of the 7th round, you want to take your shot. I don't mind that. You guys both make very valid points. I think there is certainly concern about the volume he's going to get. How's he going to hold up at his age? But also, and like you said, Ben, it's been since 2010 with Randy Moss. So that he's, been not the focal point of the New England Patriots offense.
That was also 10 years ago.
Well, I mean, he's also had many, many great seasons as recently as 3 years ago. And nobody's worried about Travis Kelce in his age. You know what I mean? Like,
is there a TB12 center in Tampa? That's what we need to know. Like, is he staying fit? Is he staying on the regimen?
There is a mobile TB12 center for Gronk, paid for in full by Brady. Okay. And real quick, before we move on to Hayden Hurst, our buddy following along on Sportscaster and Facebook, Travis Sumter makes a great point. Even in single QB formats this year, in specifically this COVID season, do not hesitate to carry a second quarterback and a second tight end, especially in this year. So to your point, Jay, it's good to have a backup plan in general, but if you do roll the dice on a riskier guy like Gronk, and I acknowledge the risk there, then you do need to back him up later on with one of the many late or totally free, awesome tight end flyers this year.
Look at us finding common ground, and I have a feeling our next player is going to bring more common ground for us, and that is Atlanta Falcons tight end Hayden Hurst, who is currently being drafted as tight end 8 with the 7th selection in the 7th round, behind Gronk, behind Evan Ingram, in front of Tyler Higbee and Hunter Henry. Right now, the Falcons have the 22nd ranked tight end strength of schedule and the 24th ranked offensive line. Hayden Hurst's current aggregate projection is tight end 12, and total Foresight likes him as, can this be right? Tight end 26. Ouch. What is going on there? However, his points per game, and this will paint the picture a little bit, in 2018, he was tight end 62 in fantasy points per game, and last season he was just tight end 42 in fantasy points per game. He didn't miss a game, but he was behind Mark Andrews. He had 28 catches on 37 targets, not a lot of volume for not missing a game, for 314 yards. Now, his catch rate was 75%, which you love to see, but on 28 receptions, he had 3 catches of greater than 20 yards and 2 scores. Some notable stats, I mean, there's obviously not a lot, but he was 7th in yards per target and 7th in fantasy points per pass route. So, there was some upside when he was targeted. The Atlanta Falcons invested some significant draft capital to acquire Hayden Hurst this offseason, and the Atlanta tight ends saw a combined 121 targets last season, and Austin Hooper, who is no longer there, averaged more than 7 targets per game. And what we've talked about Matt Ryan in his second year in offenses. So that leaves you with a high-volume athletic guy in an offense expected to be as explosive as any in the NFL. So in the middle of the 7th round, this is a very nice upside roll of the dice.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Jay. And I also agree with the the phrase roll of the dice, because that's what it is, right? We haven't seen Hayden Hurst do it. We can all sit here and we can project, right? And speaking of projections, we can look at last year. Who was the guy that was targeted the most in the Atlanta Falcons offense in the red zone? Well, it was Austin Hooper. He led the team with 18 red zone targets, two more than Julio Jones, and we all know Hooper, missed some time too. So, there's certainly some attraction there. And when I look at that red zone target share, I think, well, it makes sense. You might have Calvin Ridley, you might have Julio Jones, but let's choose the path of least resistance when we're down there in that, condensed part of the field, and let's go over the middle and let's go to Austin Hooper. So, there's certainly some attraction there. And yeah, where he's going right now in drafts, in that middle of the 7th round range, you have to think with the target share. And again, what I just talked about when it came to how he was targeted in the red zone, is certainly an attractive option. And it's anything but guaranteed, right? Because like I said, we've never seen him do it. But, if you swing and miss at that part in your draft, it's all right. I mean, we've all been there in those middle rounds. You can get by whiffing on those kind of picks. So I definitely, for me anyways, because we just talked about Gronk, I do prefer a Hayden Hurst over a Gronk, just because of the volume in those valuable red zone targets.
Exactly, Steve. I was going to say, Ben, when you're looking at this, don't you feel better about Hayden Hurst?
I already said that I would take Hayden Hurst over Gronk.
I wasn't saying it as an argument. I was asking your honest opinion. Like, Hayden Hurst just has a safer floor and similar upside in my mind as a Gronk, but you completely remove that injury risk or that durability risk. So, going next.
Well, but you don't know that. That's part of the roll of the dice. We don't know if Hayden Hurst is durable at all if he gets an actual workload. I agree with you. Nothing is guaranteed in fantasy, and the name of the game is picking your spots and being right more often than not when you pick your spots to roll the dice. And between the draft equity, the athletic profile, and all of the volume available on top of the money targets available in the red zone, that is why all the stars are aligned. So this is one of those intelligent gambles where if you are wrong, you can't really beat yourself up about it because all the signs are there. And I'm with you, Jay. All kidding aside, I'm taking Hayden Hurst over Gronk all day. But in our league of record and other drafts and other leagues, people are reaching a lot more on Hayden Hurst than what's being reflected in this current 707 ADP, at least in my experience with mock drafts and real drafts and things of that nature.
Should we let Steve cover our next tight end?
Oh, he'll definitely get to have his say because he's ridden Jared Cook to a couple of championships now, and we're talking about New Orleans Saints tight end Jared Cook, and he's currently going as tight end 11 at the 10:06 behind Tyler Higbee and Hunter Henry, in front of Noah Fant and Austin Hooper. Very interesting group of tight ends right there. Sixth worst. The New Orleans Saints tight ends have the 6th worst strength of schedule, but the Saints have the 2nd best offensive line. That'll certainly help. Aggregate projection for Jared Cook is tight end 8, and Total Foresight likes him as tight end 13. Man, it's been a while since he's been as low as tight end 13 in fantasy points per game. You got to go back to 2017. In 2018, he was tight end 5 in fantasy points per game. In 2019, he was tight end 9 in fantasy points per game. He missed 2 games last year and was still tight end 7 overall on just 41 catches. He had 661 yards, 16.1 yards per reception, 13 receptions greater than 20 yards, and 8 touchdowns. He was 9th in consistency, 2nd in consistency from weeks 10 to 16. Steve really enjoyed that part of the season. 5th in Foresight consistency, 7th in top 6 percentage, meaning there were only 6 tight ends that finished as a top 6 tight end more often than he did. He was 5th in tight end 1 percentage, 7th in tight end receiving yards, 1st in yards per reception, 1st in catches greater than 20 yards per reception, 3rd in receptions greater than 20 yards overall, 4th in touchdowns per reception, and 2nd in touchdowns overall. And at playerprofiler.com, you can see that he was 8th in deep targets and 1st in yards per target. Jared Cook is 33, but he has now been a perennial tight end one for year after year on multiple teams. And we saw how explosive he still was last year, as evidenced by a 61-yard reception that was the second longest tight end reception of the year. He still got Michael Thomas and now Manny Sanders to keep defenses occupied so Jared Cook can cook. I mean, this is honestly a pretty high value tier of tight ends at this point in the draft, and Cook is certainly a big part of that. I have zero problem with any tight end proven to be capable in a Drew Brees offense, and you really got to love that touchdown upside at the tight end position specifically. Let's go.
So, guys, I think for me, the biggest thing when it comes to Jared Cook would be that he is 33, and I want to see him healthy and on the field. We saw him a little ouchy last year, and, it did impact him. Like, if you guys recall, like, there's a little bit of hype behind Jared Cook going into drafts last season because, he's going to New Orleans. He's going to be a red zone target for Hall of Fame, quarterback Drew Brees. And we didn't see him really, like you said, Ben, start cooking until the second half of last season. Pretty much once both of those guys were healthy and on the field and had a chance to mesh a little bit. And it's really interesting, fellas. So when I was looking at the red zone numbers for the New Orleans Saints pass catchers, get this, I assumed that Jared Cook, even though he missed a little bit of time, I just figured, he's probably right up there as one of the top targets in this offense. Absolutely false. He had 9 red zone targets.
Wow.
Guys, when it comes to tight ends in the NFL, that is, trust me when I say that is far below average. However, did you guys know that Josh Hill is a tight end for the New Orleans Saints? Because I honestly did not. I'm like Josh Hill had 12. Josh Hill had 12 red zone targets. Oh, he's a tight end for the New Orleans Saints in 2019. Interesting. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that, Cook missed time, Brees missed time. So, I think there's definitely potential for Jared Cook to, I'll just keep beating this into the ground, cook next season, because when you look at Josh Hill having 12 targets, Cook having 9 targets, Travis Kelce led the NFL last season with 19 targets in the red zone. You can certainly see how Jared Cook, if he's healthy and on the field with Drew Brees, they have built that chemistry. I don't know if you guys, we talked about in a past podcast, but last season, the second half of the year, Jared Cook, he put up overall tight end one type numbers, yardage and touchdowns. We don't expect that to be what he's going to do season long in 2020. But if he's getting the target share and he's getting those valuable red zone targets, he can certainly be a value where he's going in drafts. But obviously a lot of question marks that are involved there. So, but yeah, I mean, I like where he's going, certainly.
Jay, you got anything to add about Jared Cook?
Yeah, what I was going to say was going in the group where he is, Steve, you're right. I think his price is exactly on point. And the group he's going around, we like Noah Fant. We have high expectations for him. We love Austin Hooper, but there's some question marks in that offense and what he'll be. And then you've got Tyler Higbee, he's in a situation where he has 2 tight ends on that team, and Hunter Henry's had some health risk himself. So out of that group, I really do like Jared Cook, maybe even the best, because despite missing 2 games last season, you still had tight end 9 in points per game, tight end 7 overall, and the second most consistent tight end in fantasy football down the home stretch of the fantasy season. So, even if the guy finishes in that tight end 10 to 14 range, which is where Total Foresight kind of has him pegged, I'm totally comfortable rolling with this guy this season. Ben, you pointed out, they've got an extra weapon on that offense. He could have more room to operate. And Steve, you pointed out he's got some upside in the red zone. So, and that's with being tight end 2 overall in touchdowns. So, you might expect him to regress because he was tight end 2 with 8 touchdowns last season. So you would think, well, that's high volume. You can't expect a guy to do that year over year, but he had very limited opportunities in the red zone. That could actually increase.
he had very limited opportunities overall. It only took him 41 catches to be tight end 7.
Right.
I mean,
so
think about that. Like a third of the time when he catches the ball, it's greater than 20 yards.
Yeah, as we're saying this, don't you kind of expect that Gronk would have almost mirror this kind of production, like limited sample size?
And that was my point.
Right.
Absolutely.
But,
this exact line,
yes,
but like 12 to 15 touchdowns.
Exactly.
Man.
But the difference being Jared Cook's price, he's tight end 11, getting him in the middle of the 10th round. I love that.
Absolutely. But I will say this. It is not by I added the stat that he had 13 receptions greater than 20 yards for a reason. It is not a fluke or a coincidence that happens. It's a combination of defenses paying attention to Michael Thomas and Drew Brees being an exceptionally intelligent and accurate quarterback.
Right.
Now defenses are going to have to keep their head on a swivel and look at both sides of the field and not just the Michael Thomas side of the field. And he's going to continue streaking down the seam for those greater than 20-yard receptions all season long. So whether he has 40 catches or 60 catches, like you said, at tight end 11, I love that price.
Sorry.
I was gonna say, no, that's a really good point, Ben. Like, I haven't even thought about it that way. Like, when you have somebody like, as long as Emmanuel Sanders is healthy and on the field, if you have him in the slot, I'm just thinking of this in my mind. You have Michael Thomas on the outside running like a 12-yard hook, and then you have Emmanuel Sanders dragging underneath. Jared Cook's just going to eat all day long over the middle, because he's just going to be isolated on linebacker that he just eats for breakfast or his Sunday afternoon lunch, whatever the case may be.
We mentioned OJ Howard, we mentioned Cameron Brate. Also, just keep in your speculative stash potential. Keep your eye on him. Radar. Carolina Panthers tight end going undrafted, Ian Thomas. Currently a little banged up right now, but there could certainly be a lot of volume for that guy.
Well, you guys kept yammering on and messed up my great transition here, but I was going to say thanks for bringing up Michael Thomas, because we're going to switch gears and head over to the wide receiver position, and that's who is obviously number one, because he is WR1 overall, going with the 6th selection in drafts in the first round, and he's not going behind anybody. He's going ahead of Devontae Adams, Julio Jones, Tyreek Hill, and DeAndre Hopkins. The Saints have the 6th best wide receiver strength of schedule this season and the 2nd best offensive line, which Ben had mentioned. No surprise here, his aggregate projection is WR1 and his total Foresight rank is WR1. Let's go over the last 3 seasons for Michael Thomas. 2017, he was WR6 in points per game. 2018, he was WR3 in points per game. And last season, he was wide receiver 1 in points per game. He did not miss a game. Wow. Finished with 145 catches on 176 targets for 1,688 yards. And look, all of that is alarmingly amazing. But what may actually be the most crazy stat is he had an 82% catch rate. Guys, we've been doing these preview podcasts for weeks now. Typically, somebody's in the 55 to 60% catch rate. We see some tight ends, mind you, with very low volume, in the 70 to 75% catch rate. And that is unheard of. Michael Thomas was almost 83% at the wide receiver position on 176 targets. It's just mind-blowing. So he added 9 more touchdowns. We measured 22 stat ranks for our What We Learned episode, and Michael Thomas had 17 out of 22 number 1 overall stat ranks. It's just bonkers. He was first in all consistency metrics. 60% of the time he was a top 6 wide receiver or better. 73% of the time he was a WR1 or better. 93% of the weeks last season he was a WR2 or better. He was first in targets, receptions, and yards. He was first in target share and completed air yards, and third in yards after catch. Michael Thomas set the single season receptions record last year, and he thinks he can repeat that. We'll have to see if he's right, but there's just no question who the new WR1 in fantasy football is. It's this guy. Plus, He's got Drew Brees for at least one more year, and Manny Sanders should help keep defenses a little more honest with how they play him, which could result in even higher yards per reception. The only thing you need to worry about with Michael Thomas is if you're at, say, the 106, 107, then you need to go into your draft with a firm understanding of which running backs you would and wouldn't want over Michael Thomas.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And I think all of us guys, we've probably been in some various leagues, drafts where we've been faced with that situation where you're like, man, running back is so thin and it dries up so quick, but it's so hard to pass on what we, all perceive as like just guaranteed production and volume out of Michael Thomas. And speaking to that point, MT last season, second in red zone targets, tied with Marvin Jones for first in the NFL with red zone touchdowns. Don't forget about that low round value pick out of Detroit. But yeah, and I don't expect things to really change next year. I think it's a good thing that Manny Sanders is there. Like, yeah, maybe MT doesn't get as many targets, but they could be a little bit better quality because he's got, especially if Jared Cook and Manny Sanders are out there healthy week one and they're drawing attention away from defenses. Like, I like that for Michael Thomas. Like, I don't think he has to have an insane amount of targets to put up insane production as we saw last season. So, yeah, it's tough, guys. I mean, you got your Joe Mixons, your Kenyon Drakes, you have guys that have question marks. Yeah. That, like you see the pathway to a first round worthy fantasy football player and at a more valuable position. But then again, Michael Thomas is Michael Thomas. So it's, it's a real tough one, guys. But, for me, I'll side. Like, I don't want to lose my draft in the first round. So at that point, for me, I'll just take the proven production and the safe route.
And if you're in a league where they are absolutely running back crazy and, you're at the 108, 109 and he falls to you, you cannot afford to pass him up at that point, because Michael Thomas did everything he did last year with essentially 6 games of Teddy Bridgewater, 5 games with Teddy Bridgewater as the starter. And again, we've asked this question for Drew Brees. Have we ever asked it for Michael Thomas? When's Michael Thomas ever had another legitimate receiving option on his team to detract defenses whatsoever? Being the total focal point of the defense, he did what he did and broke a single season receptions record. What's he going to do when they can't just completely sell out and like double and triple team him now? Good luck. All right, moving on to another super exciting wide receiver in this division. We've got Atlanta Falcons wide receiver Julio Jones going as the wide receiver 3 at the 202 behind Michael Thomas and Devontae Adams. And he's currently going in front of Tyreek Hill and DeAndre Hopkins. The Falcons wide receivers have the 16th ranked wide receiver strength of schedule and just the 24th ranked offensive line. The aggregate projection for Julio is wide receiver 2, and Total Foresight likes him as wide receiver 3. Did you know Julio Jones has gotten better each of the last 3 seasons in fantasy points per game? Wide receiver 8 in 2017, wide receiver 7 in 2018, and wide receiver 3 in 2019. He missed just 1 game, caught 92 receptions on 144 targets for a catch rate of about 64%, over 1,300 receiving yards at a 14.3 yards per reception average, and 6 receiving touchdowns. He was wide receiver 4 overall. Only 2 wide receivers finished as a top 6 wide receiver more often than Julio Jones did last year. Only 1 wide receiver in Michael Thomas finished as a wide receiver 1 more often than Julio Jones did last year. He was 11th in wide receiver 2 percentage and 5th in wide receiver 3 percentage. The ultimate floor and the ultimate upside all in the same guy. He was 2nd in consistency, 5th in consistency weeks 10 to 16, 2nd in Foresight consistency, 5th in receptions, 4th in targets, 3rd in yards, 4th in receptions greater than 20 yards. And at Player playerprofiler.com, you can see he was second in completed air yards and first in total target distance. Julio is 31, and he's missed less than 5 games since 2014. And in looking at the numbers, plain and simple, Calvin Ridley is not taking over that offense as the wide receiver one just yet. Julio is as consistent as it gets at an elite level, finishing with 1,400 or more receiving yards out over 5 of the last 6 seasons. And as we just discussed extensively in our last podcast, Matt Ryan does amazing things in his second year with an offensive coordinator, and that only helps Julio's cause. To me, there's a gigantic drop-off once you get outside the top 3 fantasy wide receivers of Michael Thomas, Devontae Adams, and Julio Jones this year. After that, you're dealing with a whole different caliber of wide receiver.
Man, this division is stacked at the wide receiver position. I just have to say, I was just scrolling down, like kind of looking at some of these other wide receivers we're going to talk about. But yeah, I mean, Julio Jones, most targeted wide receiver in the red zone for the Atlanta Falcons last season. And I don't expect that to change whatsoever moving forward, as long as Julio Jones is an Atlanta Falcon and playing with Matt Ryan. So, you have to love that. And yeah, we just talked about it a little bit, guys, with Michael Thomas. When you're in that part of your draft and you're in that lower part of the first round and you're facing, do I want to take a running back with question marks, or do I want to take tried and true production out of the wide receiver position? I will never fault anybody for saying, hey, I'm going to go ahead and take that tried and true wide receiver production in a Julio Jones type. So until Julio Jones is not Julio Jones anymore, I feel like you just have to keep rolling with a guy like that, because it's just signed, sealed, and delivered fantasy football production, and you have to like that, and you have to feel really good and safe about taking him where he's going in drafts right now.
I feel like we're pronouncing his name wrong. Isn't it Julio Jones Q? Like, isn't there always a Q next to his name? I thought it was permanently added. I don't know.
And that is exactly why I made sure to note that he has missed less than 5 games since 2014.
Which is
just
amazing.
Feel fine with that cue.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And that was my point, Ben. Like, it's shocking to know that he's only missed 5 games and he's battled through those nagging ankle injuries for so long. And he's been able to battle through an ankle injury for the entirety of his career and still finish.
Maybe it's just a genius that doesn't like to practice.
What
if I told you there was a legendary Hall of Fame level wide receiver that didn't want to practice?
Or he's like kind of like, you think of Bill Belichick and some of his kind of mystery injury report additions he's had. Like wasn't Tom Brady on the injury report for like 10 years in a row or something like that? So maybe
I'm banged up, guys. I'm banged up. Like, it's going to be an easy week for you. No big deal. Yeah.
They like to keep DBs guessing.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. But I'm with you. Steve, you made the point. I think with like guys like Larry Fitzgerald, who are all-timers, we always are waiting for that cliff in their career to occur, so we always want to jump off just a little bit early. And I made the mistake of jumping off the Larry train a little bit early. He was able to keep doing it at a great rate much longer in his career than I ever would have thought. And I think Julio Jones is in that same category. You said it, Steve. You want to wait and see that cliff before you're willing to not bank on Julio Jones. And I'm right there with you. I fully expect him to have another great season. And Ben, to your point, I think he still is, as much as we all love Calvin Ridley, and we'll get to him later, Julio Jones is still the wide receiver one in an offense that we have great expectations from this season.
And real quick before you move on, Travis, just adding content from social media. We appreciate this. Interesting tidbit. Julio Jones has averaged 10 plus targets for his career.
Wow. That is an alarming number as well. Travis bringing it with his live listener. So we get to, and I'm going to plug, hold on a second. I'll do this here in a heartbeat. But I'm excited to dive into our next 2 receivers, because really the only guys I like better than them outside of the top 3 receivers, next up we've got Chris Godwin. Really, only Chris Evans and Mike Godwin are guys that I really like better than these two. So, I'm excited to talk about Chris Godwin. So, Chris Godwin's the next receiver off the board right now, and he's being drafted as wide receiver 6 with the 10th pick in the second round. And he's going right now behind Tyreek Hill and DeAndre Hopkins, and in front of Kenny Golladay and Mike Evans. Right now, the Bucs have the 18th ranked wide receiver strength of schedule in fantasy football and the 13th ranked offensive line. Chris Godwin's aggregate projection is WR6, exactly in line with his current price tag. However, Total Foresight likes him this season as wide receiver 2 overall. Let's talk about his last 3 seasons. In 2017, he was wide receiver 103 in points per game. In 2018, he was wide receiver 48 in fantasy points per game. And then last season, he was wide receiver 2 overall in fantasy points per game. So now you start to understand that Total Foresight rank. He did miss a game. He had 86 catches on 121 targets with, again, a 71% catch rate. And he finished the season with over 1,300 receiving yards and a 15.5 yard per reception average. He had 25 catches of greater than 20 yards, and he had 9 touchdowns. Some notable ranks: he was wide receiver 2 overall in addition to being wide receiver 2 in fantasy points per game. He was second in top 6 percentage. Only Michael Thomas had more top 6 finishes at the position last year. He was 6th in WR1 percentage, 4th in WR2 percentage, and 4th in WR3 percentage. He was also the 4th most consistent wide receiver in football, and the 9th most consistent from weeks 10 to 16. He was 6th overall in Foresight consistency and 9th in receptions, on just being 13th in targets and 2nd in yards. He was also first, as I had alluded to before, in receptions of greater than 20 yards and 2nd at the wide receiver position in touchdowns. According to Next Gen Stats, he was also wide receiver 4 in yards after catch per reception. And according to PlayerProfiler.com, he was 4th in target, 4th in yards per target, 3rd in production premium, 6th in fantasy points per target, 9th in QB rating when targeted. And that was with Jameis Winston. Some additional notes for you. Chris Godwin emerged as an elite wide receiver last season, and now he gets to catch passes from the greatest of all time, Tom Brady. He finished as wide receiver 2 overall and in fantasy, and also wide receiver 2 in fantasy points per game last year, got a QB upgrade, and is now going as WR6? And being just 13th in targets last year, he should see a bigger share and will have every opportunity to repeat his elite 2019 campaign. I know Ben would take Godwin over Tyreek and DeAndre Hopkins, and I can't argue with that.
Yeah, and neither can I. I'm right there with you guys. And what's exciting to me, at least from a red zone perspective, when I look at Chris Godwin's red zone numbers, he was only targeted 12 times, and that is a very mediocre red zone, target share for a wide receiver. And we talked about it when we talked about Tom Brady this past Wednesday night. Like, Jameis Winston was reined in mightily by Bruce Arians when it came to his red zone, target volume. I don't think we're going to see a bit of that with Tom Brady. We just won't, because, well, say it out loud, Jameis Winston versus Tom Brady. So I could see that number being, much higher in that 18, 19, 20 red zone targets. And that could very easily lead to 8, 9, 10 touchdowns in the red zone. So you have to really like that. And all around, his volume going up. Chris Godwin's a stud. And I think Total Foresight, nails it pretty much, guys. If he's healthy and plays the entire season, I don't see why he can't contend to be the wide receiver 1 in all of fantasy football. Absolutely love Chris Godwin this season.
He's personally my wide receiver 4 behind just Michael Thomas, Devontae Adams, and Julio Jones in that order. And I say that the drop off after those 3 is gigantic because they're all so tried and true. Chris Godwin is in a little bit of a different tier, but he has the opportunity to be every much as bit of elite. And Steve, you know what? the low red zone targets for Chris Godwin encourages me because he was still be able to be wide receiver 2 overall despite that.
Yep.
And if I'm correct about Brady favoring Gronk in the red zone, even if that happens, that's not going to hurt Chris Godwin whatsoever.
Right.
And I think he could still see a little bit more volume now. What I remember talking about this a little bit on the preview pods is the comparison of the catch rate for Chris Godwin and the next guy we're about to cover, Mike Evans. Chris Godwin had 71% catch rate. Being new with Tom Brady, like, is that going to come down a little bit, maybe early on or throughout the season? I don't know, but just something to keep in mind because, you know, moving on to Tampa Bay wide receiver Mike Evans, he had a 56% catch rate. So I see that with a bigger opportunity to go up. You know, and he's currently going as wide receiver 8 at the 304 behind teammate Chris Godwin, behind Kenny Galladay, and in front of Adam Thielen and fellow division wide receiver mate DJ Moore. Just stacked. We still are not out of wide receiver 1 range in this division, guys. Sometimes we talk about one guy and he's not even a top tier guy. You know, in a couple of spots, we're going to be to the top 15 wide receiver. Like, it's just stacked. Anyways, like we said, he's got the same 18th ranked wide receiver strength of schedule and the 13th ranked offensive line. Aggregate projection for Mike Evans is wide receiver 8. Total Foresight, I love this, likes him as wide receiver 6. In fantasy points per game, Mike Evans has gotten better each of the last 3 seasons. 2017, wide receiver 15. 2018, wide receiver 13. And last season in fantasy points per game, he was wide receiver 5. Now, I will tell you, somebody who rostered Mike Evans all season, it was a very up and down, bumpy ride. But, you know, you got to attribute that more to Jameis Winston than you do Tom Brady. So I think for the first time in Mike Evans' career, you're going to probably enjoy consistency, unlike you ever have been able to from Mike Evans. He still had 67 catches on 118 targets for less than 57% catch rate, over 1,150 yards receiving at a 17.3 yards per reception average. This man, like his teammate, had a ton of catches over 20 yards, clocked in with 17 of those, and just had 1 less touchdown than Godwin with 8. He was wide receiver 10 overall. There were only 5 wide receivers that finished as a top 6 wide receiver more often than Mike Evans did last year. There were only 4 wide receivers that finished as a wide receiver 1 more often than Mike Evans did last year. Now with Jameis as his quarterback, the floor wasn't quite there. He was 28th in wide receiver 2 percentage and 20th in wide receiver 3 percentage, just 21st in consistency. Like I said, I expect that to vastly improve with Tom Brady. He was 27th in consistency weeks 10 to 16 and got hurt in that just terrible week 14 hamstring injury where I lost 5 starters, but I digress. 19th in Foresight consistency, 14th in targets, 6th in yards, 19th in 9th in receptions greater than 20 yards, and 7th in touchdowns. At playerprofiler.com, you can see that he was 4th in deep targets, 5th in completed average air yards, 2nd in total target distance. And I think Mike Evans is the one in this offense that has a chance to surprise people the most this year. He had that terrible catch rate, in my opinion, last season that I blame on Jameis Winston, and on just 118 targets. This is a guy that's never had less than 1,000 yards, and you're only targeting him 118 times. Give him the ball more. I'm not sure if his targets will increase or not, but I do expect that catch rate to improve to about 67-ish%, which last season would have given him 13 more catches, and at an average of 17.3 yards per reception, that would have been another 191 receiving yards. If that 13 catches for 191 additional yards would have happened last year, that would have clocked Mike Evans in at wide receiver 4 overall. I love the value of Mike Evans in the mid-3rd round and can't wait to see what he does this year with TB12.
So this probably doesn't come as a surprise at all, fellows, but, you know, Mike Evans, he was the leader in red zone targets for that Tampa Bay team. And I do want to say this because we have talked about Gronk, and, you know, we just talked about Chris Evans. But, you know, we talked about Godwin. Now we're talking about Evans. Both of those tight ends, Brate and Howard, only got 8 red zone targets apiece last season. Mm-hmm. So just something to keep in mind, you know, as far as how Bruce Arians' offense looks. But Yeah, Ben, you make a lot of tremendous points when it comes to Mike Evans. I've personally been a little down on him this season because, like I think about it like, well, Brady doesn't really target wide receivers downfield as often as, a Jameis Winston would chuck it up. However,
it doesn't have wide receivers to do that with.
Exactly. It's the chicken or the egg thing, right? So, it's yeah, absolutely. It's like, well, he's probably going to take more of those opportunities than he usually would. And then he's going to be much more accurate and judicious with his pass attempts. So whenever it does come Mike Evans's way, it's probably going to be a good target. So, I'm probably not giving him the credit that I should and counting on him for the consistency. I think he can probably be in the 2020 season more so than we've probably seen out of him, given the quarterbacks he's played with his entire career. So, yeah, like I said, you make a lot of good points, and it's certainly something I'm going to have to really think about in any remaining drafts I have heading into the 2020 season.
I got to say, guys, I think Mike Evans as a player is the thing that I'm most excited for this football season. Maybe not necessarily fantasy, but just football in general. His entire career dating back to college, he has had inconsistent, inaccurate quarterback play his entire football career. And finally, he gets some stable quarterback play with an accurate quarterback, the greatest of all time. So I am energized on Mike Evans' behalf this season. I am so excited to see what this guy can do with a quarterback behind center who can deliver him the ball with consistency and accuracy. He's had the career he has with that terrible quarterback play. And he's made amazing catches. His catch radius is off the charts. So now I'm just so excited for the guy, and I have to imagine he's sitting there excited as well, knowing the same thing, like, oh my God, this season, I'm actually going to get good quarterback play. This guy's going to hit me in stride. I don't just have to go up for jump balls, deep down the field. Like, I am so excited to see what Mike Evans can do now this season. So, Steve, I share some of your hesitancy a little bit because I kind of want to see it, but I'm also on the same side. I'm rooting so hard for it that I'm willing to buy in and take a leap of faith that I think Mike Evans is really going to, surprise a little bit this season. I'm with Total Foresight, man. Let's go. Top 6 overall. Let's do it. Hey, and before we move on, I do want to give our buddy Travis Sumter, who's been commenting during our live broadcast with pretty regular consistency this week. Travis is a friend of the show. He's a competitor in the Fantasy Foresight Challenge. You can find him on Twitter at TJSumter55. And he is a writer for Belly Up Sports, who you can find at Belly Up Sports on Twitter as well. So just want to give him a quick plug and a shout out since he is a constant contributor on social media with us.
And I appreciate you saying that, Jay, and it's well timed because I just made an emotional impulse decision because after Steve and I had our little exchange about Mike Evans, he said that right there is why I love this podcast. So I immediately turned around and invited him to be a guest with us on Wednesday for our celebration of the return of the NFL. So
nice, perfect.
He's checking with his boss, the wife, and as soon as he finds out, then maybe we'll have our first ever guest on Fantasy Foresight, the podcast.
I like it. Perfect. All right, we are going to switch gears away from the Bucs offense, and surprisingly, Chris Evans not the next receiver off the board. I'm shocked. All right, we're going to move on to the first Carolina Panther to come off the board, and that is DJ Moore. He's going as wide receiver 10. Guys, this is now 5 receivers in the top 10 in drafts right now from this division. They represent half the top 10. It's crazy. All right. DJ Moore, wide receiver 10, going with the 9th selection in the 3rd round behind Mike Evans, who we just discussed, and Adam Thielen, and going in front of Allen Robinson and Odell Beckham. This might be the most interesting case study we have so far, and I'm really interested to hear your guys' thoughts on DJ Moore this season. The Panthers have the 4th best wide receiver strength of schedule and the 17th ranked offensive line. Right now, DJ Moore's aggregate projection is WR7, and Total Foresight completely agrees with that assessment, as Total Foresight has him ranked as WR7 as well. In 2018, DJ Moore was wide receiver 54 in points per game, but last season he took a major jump and was wide receiver 15 in fantasy points per game. He did not miss a game, finished the season with 87 catches on 135 targets for a 65% catch rate, and over 1,100 yards, almost 1,200 yards with 1,175. He did average 13.5 yards per reception, but guys, he only got in the end zone 4 times. Now, he was wide receiver 12 overall, despite being wide receiver 15 in fantasy points per game, but he was just 32nd in top 6 percentage, meaning 31 wide receivers finished in the top 6 at the position week after week last season. He was also just 38th in WR1 percentage, but he was 6th at the position in WR2 percentage. So maybe not necessarily the highest of highs, but certainly a lovely floor there. He was also 5th.
Doesn't that sound like a whole lot more like a wide receiver 2, though, than a wide receiver 1?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you're fine, man. So he was also 5th in wide receiver 3 percentage, so it adds to that safe floor, Ben. He was also 11th in consistency, 13th in consistency from weeks 10 to 16, 22nd in Foresight consistency, and 8th in both targets and receptions, and 4th overall in yards. Very interesting numbers there. Here's the thing for me about DJ Moore. He is upgrading his quarterback, but will that mean that he's targeted less because Teddy Bridgewater can actually read defenses and put the ball where it needs to go instead of just targeting your biggest wide receiver more often than anybody else? And on top of that, he finished behind his price tag in both fantasy points overall, fantasy points per game, and his wide receiver 3 level top 6% in WR1% are a little bit alarming. Thus, I'm just a little hesitant to go down the DJ Moore route at that price if I have to rely on him to be my WR1. He finished as WR15 in points per game last year, and that's right about where I'd prefer to get him in drafts.
All right. Well, here's where we might have our first disagreement
of
the morning.
Here we go!
I emphatically love DJ Moore more than Mike Evans, more than Adam Thielen, more than Allen Robinson, more than OBJ. And here's the reason why. One, Teddy Bridgewater throughout his career has leaned heavily on his wide receiver 1, whoever that is, on whatever team that he is on. And I think that bodes well for DJ Moore and his.
And the wide receiver 1 on that team is Christian McCaffrey. Continue.
Well, to be fair, from a red zone perspective, you're actually absolutely right. So, but, of course, new coaching regime, new quarterback. And then, I love DJ Moore's talent. And then we're talking about Pro Football Focus's 32nd ranked dead last defense in the entire NFL, which is why when we talked about Teddy Bridgewater being a viable option as a streamer or somebody that you'll pick up and you'll plug and play if you're streaming quarterbacks throughout the 2020 season, why you have to like Teddy B is the same reason you would like DJ Moore. Is this team, whether it's in garbage time or just trying to be competitive throughout any NFL contest this season, they're going to have to throw and throw and throw and throw and throw the ball some more. So and guys, let's not forget DJ Moore. This is 3rd year. A lot of people say, hey, you have the 3rd year wide receiver breakout. Well, he already done broke out last season. So I think, he could. I love Total Foresight pegging him as wide receiver 7. Because I think that's probably right in line where he's going to finish. And he only had 2 red zone touchdowns. If that number were to come up at all, we could be talking about him being somebody who's right up there in the top 3-4 wide receivers in the NFL. So I don't know. Maybe I'm a little overboard, but man, I love me some DJ Moore heading into 2020.
No, Steve, you make some great points, but not as much, but similarly to Hayden Hurst at this price point. taking the step to to view him and pay the ADP price for him as a bona fide wide receiver one, that's still at this point a little bit of a roll of the dice, in my opinion. And, in this unique COVID offseason where he has not had a lot of opportunity to develop a chemistry with Teddy Bridgewater, both DJ Moore and Teddy Bridgewater are moving into a new offense. And we've never seen that elite wide receiver one or elite top 6 upside really from DJ Moore to date. So when, I pulled up, there are 2 guys going right behind him, Allen Robinson and Odell Beckham Jr. I got a little bit of homerism about Odell Beckham Jr., but we've seen that guy be an elite wide receiver, and all reports are he's been a model citizen this year. His attitude is super upbeat. He's fully healthy. Every clip I see of him from Browns camp, he looks exactly like old school OBJ. So I like that upside as a wide receiver one that I'm depending on more than DJ Moore. And Allen Robinson, man, you want to talk about, okay, he was wide receiver 7 overall, 18th in percentage of top 6 weeks, 9th in percentage of wide receiver 1 weeks, and still gave you 6th in percentage of wide receiver 2 weeks. So, I just feel like there's guys going around him that I've seen do it before, where I don't feel like I'm rolling the dice as much when I'm depending on somebody at that tier to be my wide receiver one on my offense. Steve, you make a lot of great points. But I just, as my wide receiver one, I want to feel a little bit more comfy and cozy and secure in my roster.
That's the thing. I feel, we'll see. I feel super comfy with DJ.
And I could miss out, and that's totally fair. But I know for sure that I'm all in on the true wide receiver one of the Carolina Panthers, Christian McCaffrey, no doubt.
Touche salesman.
Well, right now you guys are, Steve, you have him painted as a wide receiver 1. Ben, you like him as a wide receiver 2, and he's kind of going
a high-end wide receiver 2 at that.
Right. And he's being drafted as wide receiver 10, so it almost seems like that's kind of a fair price point between your two and the expectations, and I think that's a great spot to be in. So, and right. Steve, to your point, I certainly like him better than Adam Thielen. I like him better than Odell. Allen Robinson it's tough for me. That's probably close, but for different reasons. And like I said before, I'm just rooting so hard for Mike Evans this year. So I gotta give my guy Mike a shot. But yeah, I like DJ Moore. But to both your points, I would love DJ Moore as my wide receiver 2. Would love that.
Yeah, as a wide receiver, that's the thing. And maybe that's what I should clarify. Like I don't mind DJ Moore as your wide receiver 1, but I absolutely love him as my wide receiver 2. So that's probably the most accurate way that I can put my feelings about DJ Moore.
Yep.
And now to this point in this podcast episode, we've talked about 3 tight end ones and 5 wide receiver ones. Now we're going down to the slums at wide receiver 15. But next up, we've got Atlanta Falcons wide receiver breakout candidate Calvin Ridley, currently going as wide receiver 15 at the 404, behind Juju Smith-Schuster and Amari Cooper, and in front of Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods. He has the 16th ranked wide receiver strength of schedule and the 24th ranked offensive line. The aggregate projection is right in line with his price tag at wide receiver 15. Total Foresight likes him a little bit behind that at wide receiver 18, but still a rock solid wide receiver 2. In 2018, in his rookie season, he came onto the scene as wide receiver 29 in fantasy points per game. Pretty nice showing as a rook. Last year, he improved that and took a step to wide receiver 17 in fantasy points per game. Despite missing 2 games, he still had 63 receptions on 93 targets for a catch rate of almost 68%. He had 866 yards, 13.7 yards per reception, and 7 touchdowns. He was wide receiver 22 overall, 26th in top 6 percentage, 21st in wide receiver 1 percentage, 10th in wide receiver 2 percentage, 11th in wide receiver 3 percentage, and he was 17th in consistency. And check this out, he was 3rd in consistency from weeks 10 to 16.
Wow.
3rd most consistent wide receiver down the stretch last year. And he was 5th in Foresight consistency that measures the trajectory and the trend of how consistent a wide receiver is performing as the season goes on. And he did all that despite being just 32nd in targets per game. He was still 11th in touchdowns. And when you look at playerprofiler.com, you can see he was 6th in production premium. And prior to his abdominal strain late last year, he was on pace to eclipse 1,000 yards. And he apparently worked out with Julio on leg strength this offseason per AtlantaFalcons.com. And don't forget, he was on a hot streak, finishing as wide receiver 3, wide receiver 8, wide receiver 19, and wide receiver 14 in the 4 weeks leading up to his injury. So again, with the improvements we expect from Matty Ice's second year in that offense, there is no one I expect to be more directly, positively impacted by that than Calvin Ridley. If this offense as a whole explodes this season, I just don't see how Calvin Ridley wouldn't be a big part of that.
So yeah, I'll just quickly say I'm right there with you as far as, you know, where he's going in drafts right now at the 404. Sign me up all day long, because we know the volume's going to be there. We've seen it every year. There's usually a team or two that supports multiple WR1s in fantasy football, and there's no reason to think Atlanta is not going to be one of those. So we'll just say that. I do want to say, though, this was somewhat surprising, guys, because I've heard it on some pretty big podcasts out there when it comes to fantasy football. I've heard the phrase, you know, Matt Ryan loves Calvin Ridley in the red zone because we associate touchdowns with Calvin Ridley. He's been their most consistent touchdown producer at the wide receiver position since he's been in the league and since he's been, you know, with the Atlanta Falcons. He was only 5th on the team in red zone targets, guys. He had 7 last year.
Wow.
7. Russell Gage had 12. Very stunning to me. And in one way, I'm like, well, that makes me like Ridley a little less, because I just assumed like, well, he must be right up there with Julio Jones in red zone targets, or he's, you know, maybe a little bit behind him, maybe a little bit above. But the fact that you had Todd Gurley with more, Russell Gage with more, Julio Jones with more, Austin Hooper with more, is a little alarming. So that means that it's a good thing. Hey, Calvin Ridley finds the end zone outside the 20 pretty often. But in the same regard, we don't want to rely on that kind of touchdown production. But still, the volume is going to be there. So like I said, I'm there with you guys. I just want to point that out because I've heard it out of people's mouths. Matt Ryan loves Calvin Ridley in the red zone, and that is so far from the truth. And I will also say, in his rookie season in 2018, guys, he only had 8 red zone targets, by the way. 8. So,
everything we do on this podcast is about perception versus reality. And Steve, that's a prime example right there. We do all the dirty work, all the digging for you. Let us tell you what's actually going on versus all that noise and the perception out there.
Amen, brother. And, you know, guys, just to summarize this real quick, you know, Calvin Ridley going around the guys he's going with, Juju in that Steelers offense, I just have so many questions about heading into the season, and I just don't know if I can fully trust it. I certainly like Calvin Ridley more than Juju, Amari Cooper, probably Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods we could have a conversation about. But out of that group, I love Calvin Ridley, and I like him at his current price tag. All right, we are going to move on. All right, so now
somebody we've referenced like a dozen times over the last 2 episodes.
Yes, we finally get to talk about him. Emmanuel Sanders, next wide receiver going off the board. Now, we are actually jumping down the draft board quite a bit now with Emmanuel Sanders. He's being drafted as wide receiver 40 with the 4th selection in the 9th round. He's going behind Deontay Johnson, Marvin Jones, and in front of Jamison Crowder and Henry Ruggs. The Saints, as we mentioned, have the 6th best strength of schedule for the wide receiver position and the 2nd best offensive line. Right now, Emmanuel Sanders, his aggregate projection is wide receiver 53, and Total Foresight likes him as wide receiver 49. So he is being drafted ahead of both of those projections. The last 3 seasons, his fantasy points per game in 2017, he was wide receiver 53. In 2018, he was wide receiver 18. And last season, he was wide receiver 42 in fantasy points per game. Now, Let's talk about this a little bit. Last season, he did not miss a game after coming off an Achilles injury when everybody had written him off. Now, we talk about, we just looked back at some of his fantasy points per game finishes, and that was in a Denver offense post Peyton Manning with some really spotty quarterback play, and he went to a San Francisco team with, again, some mediocre, if I can say that, quarterback play, and now he's in New Orleans. I can't call that mediocre quarterback play. So last season, like I said, he did not miss a game after coming off that injury. He had 63 catches on 93 targets for 844 yards and 5 touchdowns. I don't know if people realize how much he actually produced last season. He was wide receiver 28 overall. And again, that's despite being just 51st in targets per game. And he was also, let's add on to that, he was 7th in top 6 percentage last season. All these 6 receivers finished in the top 6 at the position more often than Emmanuel Sanders last season. That's shocking. Yeah. He was also 25th in wide receiver 1 percentage and 30th in wide receiver 2 percentage. Now, with that injury a couple years ago, he is 4th in injury probability and 18th in fragility rating, according to playerprofiler.com. But Manny Sanders had 7 games over 60 yards, 5 games over 85 yards, and 3 games over 100 yards last year, and 1 game over 150 yards, in which he also threw a 35-yard touchdown pass. He still had 5 touchdowns among 2 teams, despite being in non-pass friendly Denver and San Francisco, as I had mentioned. Fast forward to 2020, and he's 2 years removed from that Week 13 Achilles injury in 2018, and now you hit the massive upgrade button, adding him to head coach Sean Payton, quarterback Drew Brees, and across from the beast wide receiver 1 that is Michael Thomas. I know Ben is all in on Emmanuel Sanders being a massive back-end wide receiver 2 sleeper this season, and I am as well.
So I will say I don't mind Manny Sanders, and I think we would all agree we're all big fans of Manny Sanders.
Absolutely.
Love the player, always have. Where I look at him going in drafts, Deontay Johnson, Marvin Jones, Jamison Crowder, even Henry Ruggs III, I personally like all those guys more than Manny Sanders. And for me, the biggest reason is I just don't think he's going to be needed that much by the Saints. And we talked about it Wednesday night. I'm on the side of, I think that we're going to see the New Orleans Saints really ramp up their rushing game this season. Thus, overall target share for all the wide receivers, pass catchers in general, whether it's Kamara, Cook, MT, Sanders, it's all going to be downgraded a little bit. So for me, I just like some of the upside when it comes to PPR anyways, of some of these other guys. But that being said, at the 904 wide receiver 40, if Manny Sanders plays this whole season in this New Orleans offense, he will undoubtedly outproduce wide receiver 40. So anyone listening, don't get it wrong, get it straight. I'm not saying that Manny Sanders shouldn't be taken at wide receiver 40. He's most certainly worth that pick. You just, it's what you believe in. I said it Wednesday night. It's what you think about the New Orleans Saints offense in 2020. If you think they're going to be airing it out, he could well outproduce wide receiver 40. I think he will regardless. But, that's just kind of where I'm at. I just like some of the other guys a little bit more.
Well, I don't expect the Saints to air it out next season. I don't expect them to be a team that runs the ball like – if anything, my point is, I think there's going to be plenty of pass volume to support, several fantasy relevant pass catchers on this offense. Because to me, it's Michael Thomas, it's Jared Cook, it's Manny Sanders, and Alvin Kamara as far as the pass catchers on this team. And, it's all relative to the price tag. When you tell me that this guy, all right, we talked about Gronk not having a legitimate wide receiver to take away attention. When's the last time Manny Sanders played across from a legitimate wide receiver, let alone a caliber wide receiver of Michael Thomas? When's the last time Manny Sanders had a quarterback the caliber of Drew Brees throwing him the football? The guy had over 150 yards in a San Francisco offense last year, coming off one season after he had an Achilles in week 13 the prior season. That is stupid. Usually if you have any shot at playing the year after an Achilles injury, it's got to happen a whole heck of a lot earlier than week 13 in the prior season. So I think he was still probably mending from that Achilles a little bit. This would have been a great spot for Russ at Foresight PT to weigh in on this, just because I think the second year after an Achilles, he has an opportunity to be a little bit more of that 2018 version of himself when he was wide receiver 18 overall. And I mean, I can see the volume kind of being similar, 93 targets, but I think he can do a lot more with those 93 targets in a Saints offense, with the plays being drawn out by Sean Payton and the ball being thrown by Drew Brees. And it's all relative to price tag. If you're wrong about him, a ninth round pick isn't going to kill you. I would take Marvin Jones and I would take Jamison Crowder over him, but I haven't seen it with Deontay Johnson. I don't even know if Henry Ruggs was the best wide receiver on his team in college. And I don't even know if Henry Ruggs is going to be the leading rookie wide receiver in targets on his own team. So if Marvin Jones and Jamison Crowder are gone, I am thrilled to get Manny Sanders at this tier all day.
All right, let's wrap it up. Final wide receiver on the list.
You know what? We are going down to Mr. Irrelevant at the wide receiver position, but, he's still an interesting one this year. I got to be honest. It's Carolina Panthers wide receiver Robbie Anderson, currently going as wide receiver 64 at the 1405. Nobody going behind him. Only two guys going in front of him. Keep your eye on Brian Edwards and Larry Fitzgerald. And like we've said, the Carolina Panthers wide receivers have the fourth best strength of schedule, and they have the middle of the road 17th ranked offensive line. Both his aggregate projection and total Foresight rank are significantly in front of his price tag at wide receiver 44 as the projection and wide receiver 48 as a total Foresight rank, compared to a wide receiver 64 price tag. And over the last 3 seasons, it's kind of gone in the wrong direction, but the poor guy's been with the Jets, so you can't blame him too much. He was wide receiver 20 in fantasy points per game in 2017, wide receiver 36 in fantasy points per game in 2018, and last year in fantasy points per game, he was only wide receiver 52. He didn't miss a game, but he only had 49 catches on 89 targets, 55% catch rate for 761 yards, 15.5 yards per reception, and what killed him the most is he got no touchdowns. Yeah. Even so, in that Jets offense, with very little catches, with absolutely no touchdowns, he was still wide receiver 38 overall compared to a wide receiver 64 price tag. He was 24th in consistency weeks 10 to 16, 20th in plays greater than 20 yards per reception. And at playerprofiler.com, he was 11th in deep targets, 8th in average target distance. In the last year in 5 starts, Teddy Bridgewater was 4th in deep ball completion percentage and 2nd in overall accuracy rating. Robbie Anderson was 8th in average target distance, and he has a history and familiarity with new head coach Matt Rule's offensive system, making him a very interesting late round upside dart throw, essentially going completely free.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And I probably was even like a month ago, but we've been hearing more and more out of Carolina's camp that Curtis Samuel is just kind of out there, lethargic, not impressive, which, you would think based on, we've talked about it, like, Pro Football Focus's 32nd ranked defense, this team's going to throw the ball a lot. So you would like to think like they can certainly, that offense can support more than just DJ Moore being fantasy relevant. So will it be Robbie Anderson or Curtis Samuel? And so far it seems like Robbie Anderson would be the way to go. And, yeah, I like seeing that he's at least going in the 14th round, because we've seen him go a lot earlier as a Jet.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so it makes no sense to me that he's going as late as he's going. Like, I don't care that it's a new, a new scene for him, a new offense. So yeah, he's somebody that I have a feeling he's going to end up being one of those sneaky fancy plays this season, no doubt.
I completely agree with you guys. We're going to end this episode on a positive note with all of us agreeing. But yeah, a guy in the Jets offense who only had a catch rate of 55%, no touchdowns, still was able to rack up 760 yards. I mean, that's about as bad of a situation as you could possibly be in, and he's in a better situation just because of game script, Steve, as you had mentioned, and accuracy with Teddy Bridgewater and deep ball threat with Teddy Bridgewater, as you had mentioned, Ben. So I like Robbie Anderson's situation this season, and I like him certainly better than WR64.
Love it, guys. We've done it. We have gone through every division in football and given you a wealth of information about every relevant player, from every quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. We put a lot of work into this. We take a lot of pride in giving you information that nobody else does, information that you might not have thought about. And, we have a knack for learning from each other on this podcast, changing each other's minds. And, sometimes we get off a podcast and boom, 3 trades happen in our league of record because right. Our minds have changed about something. And all of a sudden we have got some pieces that we can move around. So, I hope everybody gets as much out of these preview podcasts as we put into it. And I've had a ton of fun going live and going on video this year. And, we're just going to keep this rolling right into the regular season, just like we've done in the past. On Wednesday, it's pretty much going to be a party. We're celebrating the fact that football's back. We're celebrating the fact that, at least right now, it looks like the season's going to happen without a hitch. And we've got a great season opener with Deshaun Watson and Pat Mahomes on Thursday Night Football. And, hopefully Travis can join us. Hopefully we can have him on. He's been such a great contributor to our podcast virtually from afar. I'm just really, really happy and relieved to be on to the regular season, done with the hours and hours of research that it takes to put into these preview podcasts. And, we've got a football draft coming up on Monday. There's a lot of people that are going to be drafting this weekend. So definitely go back, check out whoever you have a question about, we covered it. And unlike some podcasts where you just have to just go through and wonder where to find a conversation about this guy or that guy, we are organized by position and by division. And in order of ADP. So you have a general idea of where to go to in an episode. And we've got our great clip cast icons at Total Foresight. So every time you're looking at a player, you click on the clip cast icon, you get taken to their website where clips of tons of different podcasts, including our own, about that exact player are just there for you to go through and listen to 2 minutes of this podcast on this guy, 2 minutes of that podcast on that guy. And then in 10 minutes, you've got several different viewpoints about the exact same player. So we take a lot of pride in what we do at fantasyforesight.com and on this podcast. And man, I'm looking forward to the best, most accurate season ever.
Ben, that is all well said. And real quick, I just want to thank both of you personally, because for those of you out there, Ben puts together all of the data for our podcasts, and it's a lot of statistics, it's a lot of numbers, it's a lot of research and preparation. So we really try to give you an all-encompassing total view of every player as we preview for the season. So I hope all of you feel like you're ready for your drafts and you're ready for the season and you kind of have a great lay of the land. So I want to thank Ben because he pours so much time and effort into it. And I want to thank Steve too, because the work that he did this preseason, analyzing every team from every divisions, red zone play calling, offensive trends, be it rushing, passing, and all of that, was such an awesome, different approach this season that I really didn't see anywhere else in fantasy football. I feel like I know, we preview each player, but you also need to know what to expect from each team heading into the season so you know where everything fits together. Like I said, we're trying to give you an all-encompassing look at every player, and we need both pieces of that, both sides of that puzzle, so everything fits together so we can go into the season. And if you missed any of Steve's posts, you can find it at fantasyforesight.com under the Encyclopedia tab. There's also a link to all of our archived posts there as well, so you can go back through and just go through all of the divisional previews. And really, guys, it was a lot of work this preseason, and it's all come to this point. We're ready. We know what to expect this season, and football is finally here. So I can't wait. I'm excited. I hope Travis can make our next episode as we preview the season. Ben, though, I'm a little ashamed, though, that once again, you previewed the first game of the season without mentioning David Johnson's name, but it's fine. I'll let it slide this time.
Oh, we'll have plenty to talk about with that gent on Wednesday, brother.
All right, fellas. Well done. We did it once again. Year 3 of this podcast, and we've completed another season preview season.
Steve?
Hey, it's a beautiful thing, guys. And as always, I appreciate being on. I appreciate being part of the team. I enjoy it. It's a great escape from, especially in the 2020 year of our lives.
Yep.
And yeah, absolutely. And hey, Wednesday morning, I'm going to have some speculative stashes out there for everybody. Looking forward to having that segment back for this year. Those guys that you just go throw on the end of your bench and hope that you just cashed in a lottery ticket.
I can't wait.
The end of the games. So
that's right. So yeah, so Steve alluded to it. We're going to be previewing the season opener that kicks off on Thursday night. We're going to preview that on Wednesday night. Also on Thursday night, at the start of that game, we are going to give you our week 1 buys and sells for the entire NFL. And Steve is going to cover on our podcast his list of speculative stashes for week 1. So instead of some like middling wide receiver 4 or 5 that you have on your bench, why not go pick up some player with a ton of upside who could have the potential based on what happens in week 1 to be a top waiver wire target the following week? You could have got him for free on your bench before kickoff even started. So he brings you those every single week. And then after that first week, we will be on every Monday night and every Thursday night. Monday, we'll be reviewing the prior week and giving you your waiver targets. Thursday, we'll be previewing the upcoming week and giving you all your speculative stashes. So we're going to be here with you twice a week, all season long, every time you need it. And, you can always check us out at fantasyforesight.com. Hit us up on Twitter. We always love to talk fantasy football, and we will be back with you on Wednesday to preview the season opener of the 2020 NFL season. Can't wait.
And that wraps up this episode of Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We thank you for joining us. Be sure to visit us, as always, at fantasyforesight.com. Use the links at the bottom of the page to find us across social media, including Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and wherever you pod. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you next time.